I thank the gentlelady for yielding. And I thank the gentleman from North Carolina for outlining his position. And we're a nation of laws. The gentleman has indicated a court has ruled on this issue, an opinion with which he disagrees, and we have a mechanism for overturning or clarifying or changing such a ruling, and it is the court system. And that case may well reach the Supreme Court. But I rise in opposition to this piece of legislation, which in my opinion is an exercise in hypocrisy. Why do I say that? That can be a harsh word. We're witnessing the party that proclaims itself to be the champion of local autonomy and less federal government involvement in local affairs. We hear that all the time. Bring to this fore legislation that would do exactly the opposite. The District of Columbia, over 700,000 American citizens, deserves a form of home rule not characterized by constant, intrusive micromanaging by congressional Republicans or Democrats. Now, if I were to ask unanimous consent that we substitute the District of Columbia and perhaps include Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Now, I'm not going to ask for that, but I'm sure I would get objection. Or if I might ask that Salt Lake City be substituted. Or perhaps even Baltimore, Maryland, my own city in my state. Or maybe even Charlotte, North Carolina. Those of us who represent those four cities would stand and say, this is not your role, Congress of the United States. Speaker Ryan just released a statement in which he said, and I quote, "The current D.C. government needs to be reined in." From where? From balanced budgets? From surplus in their budgets? Reined in? They are a model, I would suggest, of fiscal responsibility. Not always, but today. But then again, none of our jurisdictions has always been such a model.
I'm happy to yield another minute to the gentleman from Maryland.
Gentleman is recognized for an additional minute.
For yielding. I would say to the Speaker in response quite the opposite. The government and the people of the District of Columbia need to be allowed to chart their own course, which is what I think most of you say on a regular basis. It is a mystery to me and ought to be a mystery to every American who believes in the premise that people ought to govern themselves, why House Republicans are determined to strip ability from the 700,000 Americans who live in our nation's capital. They pay taxes to their local government, and we want to make that decision. I understand what the court has said, and that courts may rule that way. But shouldn't we have the patience to let the court system decide whether or not this referenda of the people of the District of Columbia is adjudged to be appropriate? The locally raised revenues from taxes and fees do not originate from the federal government, but from hardworking residents of Washington. The District of Columbia has proven Congress' wisdom in enacting the 73 D.C. Home Rule Act time and again by managing its affairs in a fiscally responsible, democratic way. I know, Ms. Norton, there are other speakers, so I will yield back the balance of my time and submit the balance.
Gentleman from Maryland yields back the balance of his time.
Well, I'm going to, Mr. Speaker.
You just did.
But simply, let me say, if we...
Gentleman is recognized for an additional minute.
The gentleman is very generous, and I appreciate it. I would say to my friends, the District of Columbia deserves the same respect that any of our governments deserve, and that, in fact, we demand for them. And I always lament how the district is demeaned. When I was the majority leader, I made sure that Mrs. Norton had a vote on the floor of this House, and that the Virgin Islands representative had a vote on this House. And one of the first things you did when you took the majority was to take that away. It was not a vote that made a difference. It was a vote that was symbolic, but it gave them the opportunity to have their name as our equals, as Americans, on that board and express their opinion. Let us not take this degree of autonomy away from them. Let us respect these local citizens as you would want your local citizens respected. I urge the defeat of this legislation. And if the courts tell us that they could not do this, so be it. But let us let the system work its will. And I thank the gentlelady and I thank the gentleman for yielding me some time. And I yield back the balance.